Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics.
All right, we are back with Stephen Saideman from Carleton University. It's not the Stephen Dale show, but there's just a lot of stuff going on in his field right now. And there was the Ottawa Conference on Defense and Security this last week, which he was a participant at. And the defense minister had some things worthwhile noting there. So I figured I would get Steve to tell us about what Anita Anand said.
Well, it's great to have a professor as defense minister because she said out at the front, I've got 3 parts of my talk. Here's what I'm going to do. And she made references to the fact that she used to be a professor. So she presented things clearly. She was far more engaging than her predecessor. And I think she instantly had a lot more credibility because she could talk about the stuff with expert, a fair amount of expertise and clarity. And so it was a strong speech. That went through Canada, the Ukraine situation, went through Canada's place in the world, and then concluded on the Canadian forces themselves. So,
okay. I guess why don't we take those in the same order? So, what is her comments on the situation in Ukraine vis-a-vis Canada?
Well, it was striking when she used the exact same language as Trudeau, as Harris, and as other people, which is that NATO will defend every inch of NATO territory. And I was like, okay, that's leaving a few places out, but that's making very clear where the line is. And yeah. I was thankful for that because we've had a lot of people discuss NATO intervention. And we had that conversation, I believe, last week about this.
Yeah.
And
say no to no-fly zones.
No-fly zone. You know, there was a lot of questions about whether the U.S. would take Polish fighter planes and rehabilitate them so that way they could be used for the Ukrainian Air Force. And the U.S. has thus far said no to that. And so what we've seen very clear is a pattern that the United States and NATO will do just about everything, but not intervene directly in the war. And I absolutely think that's the right decision to make. And that was pretty much part of the message that Anand had, which was, we will do this. And the this was, almost every day there is a new announcement about new equipment being sent to Ukraine, that Canada is going to send more equipment, lethal and otherwise, that it will provide support for NATO. We're going to reinforce our mission in Latvia. One of the things that Trudeau said last week while he was wandering around the region was that we will renew the Latvia mission without a deadline. And that's striking because ever since 2014, there was a hesitancy, and particularly part of the Europeans, and especially by Germany, not to make it a permanent mission. And now people are just starting to talk about it being permanent, and that has all kinds of ramifications. Maybe what we'll do, instead of rotating forces every 6 months, we may do the Cold War model of sending troops to be there for 3 years, which means sending spouses and kids to live in Latvia for 3 years. I don't think it's very likely, but those kinds of thoughts about longer term basing, that we're not going to be thinking about pulling these folks out anytime soon, that the Russian threat's not going to go away, I think was a really important comment, both by Trudeau and by Anand in the past week or two. And so I think that's important. So I think she said all the right things about Ukraine and what we're doing and what we're trying to do and how much support. One of the striking things is she said that she's talking to the Ukrainian defense minister almost every day. I was like,
okay. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second point, I think, was Canada's place in the world.
It's for Canada's place in the world. So she did a tour of the horizon about what we need to do with NORAD, with NATO, and with the Indo-Pacific. And what was striking, there was a couple of things that came up in the Q&A where she got really careful. And what she really got careful about was she was asked about, well, you talk about NORAD modernization. It's very clear the government has made that a priority. She talked about how she looks at her mandate letter and invokes it every single day. And one of the items of the mandate letter is NORAD modernization. And that was something the government was focused on even before the pandemic. And now they sort of have the green light, essentially, to spend lots of money because, well, Russian activities have made everything a lot more salient than it would have been without that. And And so she got pushed on, well, if we're going to do all this stuff with NORAD, shouldn't we join the American anti-ballistic missile system? And it was really interesting how she said, we're going to do a lot of things at the ground level. And I was trying to figure out whether she was about to invoke Meatloaf. We'll do everything, but we won't do that.
Yeah.
And I think this has a lot to do with intra-liberal party sensitivities, because if people remember back to the early 2000s, George Bush pulled the United States essentially out of the ABM treaty. And this was very upsetting to Canadians because Canada, and particularly the Liberal Party, cares about rules-based order, international institutions, all that sort of stuff. And so we opted out of that. And that was one of the tensions between Canada and the United States when Bush was in power. Well, this is almost 20 years later, and the ABM treaty ain't coming back. And so I'm not sure why this should be something that the Liberal Party is super sensitive to, because it's not like our staying out of American ABM is going to somehow bring the treaty back, or is somehow not, lead to the treaty going away. It's gone.
Right.
And so this is a weird liberal hang up, I think. I think if Stephen Harper was prime minister, it wouldn't matter. And if it was Jean Charest as prime minister, which is not going to happen, I don't think it would matter. But I think it's a particularly liberal hang up. So that was one thing she was careful about.
Okay.
The other thing she was careful about was people were pushing her, are you going to do a defense review? A lot of things have changed over the course of the past 5 years since the Strong, Secure, Engage document was written and drafted and discussed, and all kinds of meetings in town. And she basically said, we don't have time for that. We got to make decisions now without doing a review. And she doesn't want to wait for a review to make those decisions. And I kind of thought that was kind of the wrong answer. I mean, I understand the point, which is we got to do stuff, not just talk about doing stuff. But we need to get in the habit of having a review every 4 years. The United States calls it a quadrennial review. Other advanced democracies do this all the time. And that means having a group of people within D&D constantly evaluating what are the threats, how are we doing on meeting the promises of the last review, what do we need to do to adapt in a systematic kind of way. And we don't do that. We have a review every whatever. And I guess one of the points that might be here, and also the procurement stuff, which we'll talk about, is we don't necessarily have the staff and the muscle within the government to constantly do this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so since they're so busy doing the culture change stuff and the other things that are hot priorities, they don't have the personnel within D&D to just be sitting there going through the old documents and thinking about the new way ahead and all the rest of it. But I think it was Richard Fadden, and in his comments early in the day, talked about we need to be thinking about the medium term. We need to be thinking about the medium term and the long term. We're always focused on the crisis of the day. And I do think we need to have folks dedicated to thinking about the medium term. And that's what that kind of review would be. It's like, okay, we were doing this stuff today, but what's happened in 3, 4, 5 years? What's happened in 10 years?
Well, and it's also good to have some kind of a roadmap so that you have an idea of what your priorities should be looking at when it comes to engagement and procurement and so on.
Well, we have that, but it's a document that's now 5 years old. So we're still, right. I mean, that still is the signpost for all policymaking. And a lot of the SSE is not dead. It still matters, and it's still a reasonable signpost, but it probably should be adjusted.
Okay. And I think the last part was the current state of the Canadian forces.
The current state of the Canadian forces, well, again, she made a lot of commentary about how the troops have done a really good job the past couple of years under very stressful conditions, and they have. She really didn't talk about, she talked about culture change and things like that, but she didn't really talk about the fact that, well, there's been an abuse of power crisis in the Canadian Armed Forces for a few years now, and what progress have we made on that? And now she's only been around since November, and she's been kind of busy with this war. But this, I've been referring to it as not just instilling or reinstilling civilian control of the military. I've been referring to it as inflicting civilian control of the military. And it would have been interesting for her to talk about that, but that might not have been the best environment because this is a very pro-military crowd, and she, I'm sure, is trying to build up her credibility within that crowd before she starts making decisions that they're going to hate. Yeah. But she talked about the challenges of recruitment and retention, that these are really essentially existential challenges to the military. And during this conference, your friend of mine, John Iveson, came out with an amazing op-ed up here where he called for us reaching 2% of GDP on defense in 3 years, which was just ridiculous because it requires us to, spend money on what? How are you going to spend that much money? It's not just spending, more money. It's, to get 2% 1 year, but every year, how do you spend $10-15 billion more a year every year?
And I've had conversations with people in the military about this, and it's basically, we simply can't spend that much money because we don't have the capacity to do so. And a lot of that capacity is manpower, or just people, I guess, if we're being a little more neutral in our terminology. There's not enough people to do the work that needs to happen to get this money spent. And even with things like the slush breaker ships that are coming slowly off the line out of Irving, they don't have enough people to actually crew them. And that's a problem.
Well, even if you made the big expensive decisions, okay, we're going to do NORAD modernization, you don't all spend that money in 1 year.
Yeah.
If you made the decision to buy F-35s or Gripens, which is the choice right now, that was one of the things you did seem to indicate that choice was forthcoming, that it should be happening relatively soon. I think in 2022, and after an election is always a good time to make that decision. Even if you make that decision, you're not forking over, the full allotment of money on day one, or, it'd be over the next 10 years. And so that's not going to get you to 2%.
Yeah.
The shipbuilding, if we want to spend money fast, let's buy foreign equipment. That would be the way to do it. Okay, South Korea, Denmark, build us some ships or give us some ships you already got lying around. We'll give you cash. That would do it. But again, you raise the problem of do we have enough personnel to staff these things? And that gets back to the recruiting crisis, which is personnel is 50% of the budget, more or less. And if you want to spend lots more money, you need to do two things. You need to have more people and you need to pay them more. Now, pay them more is easy. You could just change how much everybody gets paid and then hope that the Phoenix type system doesn't blow up. But it also means hiring more people. And guess what? We actually, despite all the discussions about the state of the economy, we have really low unemployment. There's lots of rivalry for smart young people. Why do people would want to live out in the middle of the wilderness, which is where a lot of our military bases are? It's a very hierarchical structure. Not a lot of people enjoy that kind of thing. I spent a year working amongst the military, and I could tolerate that for a year. And so we're already short of our recruitment targets by about 10,000, which is more than 10%, close to 15% of the force, right?
Yeah.
And so we first got to catch up before we expand. But she suggested we're going to get larger. And it's like, okay, well, we could try that. But that requires us to fix the force, which is not just pay people more and recruit a wider, more diverse range of people, but also means improving the conditions so that, and she mentioned it, that we don't, I think it was her that mentioned that you're not going to join an enterprise if you're going to be suspicious about the people around you abusing you.
Yeah.
And so we've got to fix the culture that is part of us being a better, bigger force. It's not just, well, we need to do this or that. We need to do this and that. We need, I'm sure there'll be people in the military who will say, we can't focus on culture change anymore because we've got this existential threat posed by the Russians. And the answer is, if we don't have a military, then we can't really do that. And what we need to do to have a military is we need to treat our people better.
Yeah.
So I think she's going to stay hot on that, and rightly so.
Yeah, and it would seem to me to be in keeping with kind of where she's coming from in terms of her previous career as a professor of corporate governance. So I mean, she has come into the job treating it like there is a governance problem in this institution. And I think that is helpful, and I think that's something that needed to happen because I think that was being ignored for a long time. So I think that's a positive in terms of what we're seeing.
I definitely think she's the right person for the job, both because of her corporate governance background, so she can address the fact that CAF has a governance problem, D&D has a governance problem, and that her previous job was procurement. I mean, she mentioned, that was her previous gig. it was a backwater until it became, until it was we were getting vaccines, and she was very successful at getting vaccines for Canadians. And so she knows what the procurement problem that exists within D&D. And to be fair, not every procurement process is a. Can I say shit show on on this?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Not every procurement problem is a shit show, but so there are things that are successful, things that do get done, but a lot of them have real problems, and a lot of the real problems actually had to do with the people in the room the other day, which is defense contractors, that they don't play nicely with each other. They crap all over the process if they lose, and so I'm not sure what she's doing to wrangle those folks, but I do think that there are processes that we can fix with inside of government to make things work better. And I think she's working on that. I just don't know. I mean, that's a long-term process. I mean, one of the striking answers she gave throughout all of this was in 2018. I asked John Vance at a similar kind of conference. Okay, you've been here for 3 years. You're talking about all these changes you want to install, but 3 years is the average term for a CDS. So how are you gonna make sure that this stuff lasts beyond you? And he joked that that he had talked to my dean and that he expected me to be moved on soon myself, and that worked really well for the room, but it wasn't a good answer for the question. Yeah. And she anticipated that by saying, I'm a politician. I don't know how long I'm gonna be here, and we're a minority government, so I could be gone any day now. So I'm focused on trying to institutionalize the things that are going on. That if I want this stuff to work, I can't just assume I'm going to be around here in 5 years.
Yeah.
And that was such a healthy attitude. And such a realistic attitude. And a necessary one, because what we need to do is change the game of how procurement works in Canada and how civil military relations works in Canada. And those have to be changes in how things are done in a big, big way. I think people should ask her, do we need a new National Defense Act? Do we need to change the basic rules of civilian control of the military? And I hope to have an opportunity someday to ask that question of her, because I think when I talk about this stuff with military folks, they're like, well, the CDS is the one who's directly responsible to the Prime Minister. The Deputy Minister is not involved in that. And so everything flows to the Minister, to the CDS, to everybody else. Like, there's no other civilians involved. I'm like, I don't like that at all.
Yeah.
So we'll see if they're going to change the rules of the game or just make the rules more apparent about how the military may not quite understand how civilian control works.
Just one other thing on procurement. I noticed this last week, the opposition made a demand that the government just fix the procurement system. And it's like, oh, just like that. And my second part of that answer was, weren't you guys part of the people who broke the system because you took a system where you had a lot more civilian control over procurement, turned it over to the military guys and said, go nuts. And that just broke the entire system. So I just wondered if you had any particular thoughts on that.
I'm not sure your portrayal is entirely fair.
Okay.
I don't know how procurement worked in the early aughts. In the 2000s. I do know one of the things that happened under the Liberals that the Conservatives didn't fix was they cut a lot of the staff within D&D who were the procurement specialists,
right?
Who were the ones writing the contracts, and
that makes sense too.
Doing all that kind of work, and so that helped to break the system. But that's a shared party thing. Yeah, it's not just a one party thing. And one of the things the Conservatives did do was they created a panel, the independent panel. One of my colleagues, Phil Lagasse, has been on it for quite some time. Started out as the independent panel on the fighter procurement, but became all major procurement. Right. Where they sort of look through and say, okay, the military wants these requirements. Well, do we actually require these things to have these capabilities, or is this something that the military just wants because it's cool, or it fits their ideology, or whatever? Right. And so that's been an ongoing process. Now, the previous defense minister didn't, kept the process, but then didn't read the stuff. And so I'm pretty sure this defense minister probably reads the stuff a bit better. So that was actually something Jason Kenney did that was actually pretty good.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, I can say that I said one nice thing about Jason Kenney in my life. And so, but
I do remember
it's
when that
really,
panel came out and the media kept insisting that the panel tell them what their recommendation was. And they kept saying, no, that's not our job.
well, this is one of the strange things about Canada that drives me crazy, which is advice to cabinet is covered in secret sauce. And so you don't really know the recommendations that government's getting. So you don't know if they're actually listening or not. And
Yeah.
it may not make sense in the moment because you want people to be freely unfettered to present their opinions, but the historical record should be clear. And yet this stuff we never know about. And as a result, we can't really evaluate the assessments. Like one of the most important moments during the run up to the Iraq War was that when Army Chief of Staff General Shinseki was in front of Congress testifying. How often do we see that televised in Canada, the Army Chief of Staff testifying? Anyway.
Almost never.
Yeah. So anyway, he was testifying, and he was testifying about stuff that was Army stuff, not that stuff that was strategic stuff. But because he was in front of Congress and the war was on the horizon, he was asked by Congress, by the people on the Defense Committee, the Armed Services Committee, how many troops do we think we need to occupy Iraq? He's like, hey, I'm not part of that planning. It's not my job. You should talk to those other people. And they said, well, since you were confirmed by Congress, you got to tell us what you think is your best professional military advice. You happen to have, been in charge of the peacekeeping forces in Bosnia for a period of time, so you know this stuff. How many troops do we need? He said, well, if I have to answer this question, something like 200 to 250,000 troops to occupy Iraq. And at the time, it was very clear that Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, was trying to have as small force as possible. And so we know, going backwards now, who owns that decision. Because the military advice was clear.
Yeah.
And what the civilians did was different. And so who's responsible? Who's accountable? We know. In Canada, it's very hard to know this stuff because all the advice to cabinet is secret. And so it's really hard for us to retrospectively go back and go, what was said, who made the decisions, and you can kind of reconstruct things, but that doesn't work out so well. And it would be really nice if we could get all this advice to cabinet so that way we could figure out what actually happened and then hold responsible whoever was responsible. At least, again, historically, if not in a political moment.
Right. Okay. And my last question about this conference is, I know the Arctic came up a little bit. This is something I know you have particular feelings about in terms of everyone is kind of lighting their hair on fire that the Russians have started reoccupying these bases and so on. Just your quick thoughts on this notion about the preparedness that everyone thinks we should be doing about it.
Well, there's a three-part answer to this. First is people worried about China. It's like China's a very far point away, and if the Americans want to shut the Arctic to the Chinese, they can do that because you have to get past various straits to get there. It's a far way, and right now the Chinese problem is getting out of the South China Sea past all the American-friendly countries that are surrounding China. For the Russians, there's the two-part answer is A, most of the Russians are investing in the Arctic because they too have an Arctic.
Yeah.
And they too, and as much as we are concerned, the Northwest Passage is going to become a major pathway. It's not nearly going to be as much of a major pathway as the Arctic above Russia. That one is more navigable. It's more important for getting things from Europe to Asia and back. And so they're much more worried about that. They also have a history of fearing foreign invasion. So they worry about this, what used to be the uninvadable flank being a security threat. So despite the fact that Putin is Putin, we have to think about it a little bit from Russian perspective, and their north is their security concern. And so a lot of what they're doing is investing in their north, not in targeting our north.
Okay.
That's part one. And part two, if the Russians wanted to seize a random Canadian island in the Arctic, the problem is not attacking them. The problem will be rescuing. Because if the Russians can't provide logistics to folks 100 miles into Ukraine, think about how hard it is to provide logistics just to the far north. On our side of the far north, forget how to get across the top of the globe to get to our far north from their far north.
Yeah,
that would be a nightmare for any military logistician. So I understand why people are concerned about it. There are reasons to invest in the Arctic. I think it's more about warning. I'm also skeptical about ballistic missiles. I've talked about ballistic missiles before. We could join the ABM system so that way we're inside most American rooms. It's not going to change our lives because guess what? The anti-ballistic missile system doesn't work, and it's not going to protect us as a magic shield from a Russian attack. If the North Koreans send us one missile, we might be able to maybe knock it down.
Okay.
But I think the thing is, it's about knowledge. It's about asserting our sovereignty claim. It's ultimately about rescue and environmental disaster. So once cruise ship starts going through the Northwest Passage, we'll have to have the ability to get there to rescue these people, because if something goes wrong, help is not hours away, but weeks away.
Yeah.
And the distances are amazing. I mean, the people watch this. How many people have gone to the Northwest Territories, Yukon? The answer is you haven't, because it's freaking expensive. Why? It's a ways away. I want to go there someday, and it's going to be like saving up for that trip is going to be a big deal. So it's really hard to operate in the Arctic, even as things get warmer. It's still not going to change the tyranny of distance. And so I'm not going to sweat a Russian invasion from the north. There's Russian invasions in the east that we should be sweating, and we are.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure, Dale.
All right. Thanks.
And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.